We get some history here with the fall of the northern kingdoms. It was really cataclysmic and permanently devastating. When their infidelity was that they worshipped other gods. Elijah dealt with King Ahab. He was and his wife Jezebel. They had built shrines to the god Baal. I mean, their infidelity was obvious, and self-centeredness and deceit and abuse of power, and the list is long of the failures of the kings in the northern kingdom. And so it's more of a natural consequence. The way it's described scripturally is, they abandoned God, so God abandoned them. And because there are numerous other accounts where, with all the odds against them, a faithful kingdom of Israel is victorious because of God's goodness to them. So it's it's a sort of a morality play, if you will. But they failed, and the Assyrians conquered them. And the way that the Assyrians conquered them was made the devastation even greater. It wasn't just taking them, and then sometimes they would exile. Different nations would exile the inhabitants to take away the leadership, to weaken the structures so that revolts couldn't happen. What the kingdom of Syria did is they took the tribes and they scattered them all throughout their holdings so that they didn't even have any continuity. Later, when the southern kingdom of Judah will be conquered, the Babylonians will do that, and then they'll exile them, but they keep them together. And actually it becomes a very important formative time in the history of Judah and then subsequently all of Israel. Because they'll come back eventually and reestablish and have a clarity of vision of who they are. But the northern kingdoms, those are the lost tribes. Those tribes were scattered and no one knows anything else about them. Their history ended. Whereas, Israel's still alive today, and the history and our faith, we're part of that. So you can see how horrible and devastating that was, and that was due to such infidelity. Now, by contrast, what we have today in the saints that we recognize is incredible fidelity on the parts of St. John Fisher and Thomas More. And of course, they weren't the only ones who were faithful and suffered martyrdom or risked their lives if they weren't actually martyred. One of my favorite saints, her story is quite inspiring, is Margaret Clitheroe, who was a laywoman, but she hid priests and helped them who were trying to be faithful to Rome, and she eventually suffered martyrdom herself. But again, great courage and devotion and fidelity to the faith. And it's a witness that we see in Thomas More's life, and I think because it falls right on the heel of Father's Day here, for the Office of Readings that's provided for this feast day, there's a beautiful letter from St. Thomas More to his daughter, Margaret. Because she's agonizing, his whole family agonizing over what's happening to their father and how he's being treated. Here he was the Chancellor of England and had everything available to him, and authority and leadership, but now reduced to just absolutely nothing and living in the worst of conditions in prison, the Tower of London. But he speaks with a perspective of faith that is so enlightening, because it's not what happens to you, it's how you understand what happens to you, that you see God is still there. Listen to this. He talks about how the king had shown him such great honors before this calamity, before his arrest. And now the king has done good things for him. Now the king has done this to him. And listen to the way he describes it. In doing this, by imprisoning me, His Majesty has done me such great good with respect to spiritual profit, that I trust that among all the great benefits he has heaped so abundantly upon me, I count my imprisonment the very greatest. I cannot therefore mistrust the grace of God. And the reason he saw it as the greatest, because sometimes calamity forces us to recognize, who am I? Who is God calling to me to be? What kind of faith do I have to have in me that I need to call upon for God's strength in order to get through this ordeal? I mean, here we are, facing a coronavirus, facing all other kind of calamities. And it's a time that, there are a lot of different reactions, but to seek the strength of God and to be called to greater fidelity and find peace in that, that's what St. Thomas More is such a great witness of. In fact, he goes on further to say that he knows he's weak. He acknowledges his own personal sinfulness all through this. And there but for the grace of God go I. But he also says this about comparing to St. Peter. I shall remember how St. Peter, at the blast of wind, remember when they were at the storm and Jesus is walking on the water and the apostles are in the boat and they're afraid they're going to sink. And Peter says, Lord, if it's really you, ask me to come to you across the water. And Jesus says, come. And he steps out and Peter walks on the water. And as long as he's looking at Christ, he's fine. But when he looks at the waves and the storm, then he starts sinking because his faith is shattered, okay? So St. Thomas More is saying, I shall remember how St. Peter at a blast of wind began to sink because of his lack of faith. And I shall do as he did. Call upon Christ and pray for him for help. Pray to him for help. And then I trust he shall place his holy hand on me and in the stormy seas hold me up from drowning. Now what a beautiful testimony of faith, writing from prison to his daughter Margaret. But then he even goes further. And if, like St. Peter, I should fail, I should swear and forswear. Remember, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. I shall trust, may God, our Lord, in his tender mercy, keep me from this failing. Still, if this should happen, he's humble enough, afterward I trust that in his goodness he will look on me with pity as he did upon St. Peter, and make me stand up again and confess the truth of my conscience afresh, and endure here the shame and harm of my own fault. He knows that God will be merciful to him. He's not cavalier about that, but he knows he's weak, but God's strength is greater. And finally he ends, and therefore, my good daughter, do not let your mind be troubled over anything that shall happen to me in this world. Nothing can come but what God wills. And I'm very sure that whatever that may be, however bad it may seem, it shall be for the best. There's a tremendous faith in him, which I think is helpful to us now in our own time. And even this comment about hypocrisy that Jesus talks about is really saying, yeah, we can look out there and see all the problems and point at everybody's failings. But that's not what we're called to do. We're called to look at the beam in our own eye, look at our own lives, and say, how am I called to be faithful to God at this moment of my life, in this moment of history? And St. Thomas More is a remarkable witness of that.